Center for Faculty Development, so welcome to our space. Hi, Earl. Come on in. And I'm just going to turn it over to Josh.
All right.
Go from here.
Well, first of all, thank you all for being here. I am Josh Cromwell. I'm Institutional Repository Coordinator here at the university. This is the fourth of our 5 open access panels that we're doing this month. So our final panel will be this coming Wednesday at the exact same time, so 2 to 3 p.m. over in Asbury Hall. And so that'll be our session looking at open access in health and nursing. But today we will be looking at open access in the perspective from the perspective of the arts and humanities. So just to get started, I'll let each of the panelists introduce themselves and then we'll kind of dive on in.
I'm Sam Rudin, Professor of Philosophy and Director of the Office of Research Integrity.
I'm Chris Foley, Assistant Professor of English on the Gulf Coast. I am the editor of Coastlines, the literary journal for the USM Gulf Park campus.
I'm Assistant Professor of English. My name is Craig Carey, and I'll be talking mostly today about my American Literature class. OER stuff.
A couple of quick housekeeping things I should have mentioned before we get started. We've got some pens, brochures over there on the desk, so be sure to grab some of those on your way out. We've also got evaluation forms, so if you would, grab one of those, fill that out before you leave also. All right, so now we will just sort of launch in. So what we've typically kind of done with these panels so far, we've kind of attacked this topic from a couple of different angles. We've looked at it from the publishing side, but then also the education side, the teaching side. So what I figure we'll start with is we'll spend our first few minutes kind of talking about this publishing piece. So when we're talking about open access, what we're generally talking about is making information freely available to folks, right? So scholarship, research, things you're producing, making that information available to as wide an audience as possible without fees if possible, so that that information is readily accessible. The publication bit for this is a little tricky in the arts and the humanities, right? Because some of the formats in which you communicate your scholarship is a little different, right? Because there's number one, there's the tendency more toward monographs than toward articles, and also there's the tendency toward in the arts things that are not traditional publications per se, right? So bearing that in mind, how does some of that fall within that framework of open access? Kind of what's the thought generally toward open access? Is that sort of a mentality of this can't really work given the things that we do in our area? Is this something where we see areas that could work? That's kind of just a general question to get us started, but what do you think about some of that?
Well, yeah, I'll jump in first. So Craig and I are both in English, and that is actually a field that does rely more on journals, more heavily on journals than a field like history. And you can actually see that in some of the tenure requirements from English versus history. My first peer-reviewed publication was actually in an open access journal, so it's called Early Modern Literary Studies, and it's now 20 plus years old. It's very well respected, but it was one of the first journals online, and so the open access really comes from the fact that it was an online only journal. So anyone can go and Google Early Modern Literary Studies and ultimately find their way to the article that I published in that journal. So in one respect, if it's an online journal, right, it's open access as long as it doesn't have fees associated with that. So I don't think that there's necessarily a resistance to it. It's just that when you look at the older journals that were principally print-based before the advent of the internet, those tended to be subscription-based. Sure. And so, but the internet has a game-changing potential, I think, with respect to that.
In philosophy, my sense is that, as Chris was suggesting for English, it is, in contrast to disciplines like history, a lot of the activity goes on through journal articles. However, I don't get the sense that open access publishing has really caught on. I think there are two main reasons for that. Is philosophers generally don't have any money. And a lot of times to publish open access, you, the author, somehow has to pay for it. maybe you're working on a grant that's going to pay the publishing fees, or maybe your department or institution has funds available. But at least at this institution, and I think at philosophy departments nationwide as a general rule, there just aren't a lot of funds to pay for that. So that's the big thing. The other thing is prestige-wise, I can't claim that there are no open access journals in philosophy with significant prestige. There may well be, but I think in general they haven't really caught on, and philosophers are somewhat skeptical of stuff that gets published open access. Maybe that's unfair. Maybe it's a sort of prejudice we ought to outgrow, but I think that's still where the discipline is as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just add to that, the two things that open access journals, at least in the field of the humanities or literary studies, kind of run up against, the problems they run up against is the prestige questions, but then also kind of the peer review process as well. For better or worse, the kind of institutional requirements that a professor has to meet and match on a yearly basis, they tend to look for prestigious journals, but also journals that are kind of substantive in their peer review process. And while there are some up-and-coming open access journals, there are far more solid, substantial, prestigious print journals. So the tendency is to send your work to the print journals first, because in some ways it benefits your career more. While it might not get as large of an audience, I don't think just because something is open access and online means that it's getting a large audience. I think it's easy to assume that these online journals are getting a large audience, but I haven't seen any data to convince me of that quite yet, at least in literary studies. So those are the two things I would just add.
I'm going to make a quick executive decision and switch over here. I feel like I've got my back to too many people over here. So.
And now, yeah, so my discipline is dance. So my primary research is in creating dances and coaching dances. However, I do scholarly research, but it depends on the university. At this university, we value both of those. So if I only make dances, that can count as my research, but there's an option for me to sort of delineate how I'd like to do it. So I do both. However, I would add that because most people don't expect dancers to be doing research in that way, that our journals are also peer reviewed, and they come, the primary journal Dance Education, which I've written for, comes as part of a membership as a national organization, and so that's all sort of tied together. And so while there's a way of sharing, you get like 50 free shares of it, but then otherwise you have to be a part of that organization in order to get that. But it's a large organization, so you feel like you're getting it disseminated enough, and of course there's print versions available. So I think it just depends on the individual artist's view of that.
Yeah, and so I mean that's one of the topics of conversation that's kind of come up several times as we've had these discussions. Is that question of audience, really, sort of. On the one hand, you're doing this research, you're doing the scholarship because you have to tick these boxes for T&P processes, all that. But also at the same hand, you do want it to be viewed by lots of people. You want it to be discovered, you want it to be accessed. And sometimes those are almost in a little bit of a tension depending on, so kind of how all that plays out can be a tricky situation sometimes.
Yeah, can I add to that? I have published subsequently in print, non-open access journals, but I'm kind of turning now to my monograph. And one of the things I discovered over the summer in reviewing presses is that there is commercial and academic presses are starting to respond to some desire for open access on the part of authors and institutions as well. So I actually did my PhD at UC Santa Barbara, and while I was a grad student there was a major push to have more of the scholarship produced by the University of California become open access. And if we think about the UC system or University of Southern Mississippi as a public institution, we consider our teaching responsibilities, which is one of our responsibilities as faculty members, to be in the public service, right? We're employees of a public institution. We're teaching students. But if we think about our research in that same vein, I mean, in some respects, our research is publicly supported and is part of the mission of the university. So if we keep that in mind, I think there's a case to be made that even the research that we're publishing, there should be more of a move to make more of that freely accessible, because that operates ideally in the public domain as well, given the nature of the institution. But the question of who ultimately pays for it with respect to monographs is an important one, and it's still being worked out. I mean, to be honest, I got an email earlier today from Bloomsbury, which is a major commercial publisher in Shakespeare studies, and they're touting their open access monographs. But I went to click on the link for more information, and there isn't really any more information. I mean, they're clearly doing it, but how you go about doing it, who pays for it, I mean, these are things that are kind of being worked out in the moment at various presses.
Yeah, that's kind of what I've seen and what I've looked at thus far too, is that I'm starting to see some pushes towards some open access monograph initiatives, but kind of like you say, it seems like they're still sort of figuring out exactly how that will work. And so it's I think it's coming, but it's not really there yet. It doesn't seem like, at least on a bigger scale. There's some, but like I said, it's just kind of early, and hopefully maybe that's a trend that will grow as they figure out some of those pieces.
Well, I think, it's one important step, as Chris was saying, would be for major universities to kind of buy into
Right.
letting their journals go open access. That is the only thing that I see creating a kind of domino effect, because universities aren't going to give up the prestige of publishing their print journal. They're not going to suddenly just go to open access if there's not a financial incentive to it. Or so I think it's beyond kind of authors sending out their stuff to open access journals at this point. It's really at the institutional level where institutions have to commit to it, and I'm not sure if we're that close to that or not. I don't know.
Yeah. So one of the questions, I guess, that arises, and we touched a little bit about some of the experience that some of you have with OA publishing, is I'm just curious a little bit about, what are some strategies to navigate that cost issue? What are some things you see that might be a way around that? Because, I mean, you're right. I mean, a lot of the humanities disciplines don't have the resources that some of the sciences have that write these big grants for whatever research they're doing that brings in these big sums of money. And so, okay, we can take some of that and offset some author fees if the case be, and then publish whatever we want to. So.
I mean, one thing I would say is that it's really important, if you're thinking about publishing in an open access journal, to really investigate on the front end exactly what the whole thing is going to look like, the whole process. You don't want to get into a situation where you submit, you get accepted, and then you find out that there's a couple $1,000s in publication fees you're asked to pay. And at that point, what can you do? You go begging your school director or the dean of your college or something like that. But, and maybe they'll help, and maybe they won't. But you should at least know what you're possibly getting yourself in for on the front end.
Yeah, and to just echo Craig's comments from earlier, I see it really as a kind of question that ultimately has to be worked out between academic institutions and academic presses, university presses and commercial presses that publish academic scholarship, because we're in a moment where more things are readily available. Craig, your dissertation may be online, mine certainly is.
I still have one more year. They keep giving me another year.
The embargo, that might be good for you. But
keep extending it.
When some of your stuff from earlier in your career is ultimately on ProQuest and can be downloaded instantly by anyone who has access to that, it's not open access, but it's very widely available. That becomes a potential pitfall for acquiring a book contract for a dissertation turned book or a monograph that comes out of your dissertation in some significant way. And so you know, and I've also heard that libraries associated with research universities, especially public ones, are now essentially not buying books for which the dissertation might be available via ProQuest. There's this kind of, you know, and if that's the case, it's sort of like an arms race to who can do this the most cheaply, but then if none of them are ultimately economically viable as a result of that, you obviously don't have a good situation. So it's about the economic viability of both academic publishing and universities. And, you know, ultimately I think those have to work together.
And that was a really interesting question too, because I've heard competing ideas on that. I've heard some places point to just what you say, that dissertations adapted to books don't tend to sell as well. I've heard others that say, no, we don't look at that at all. That really would be a good research topic for someone to kind of dig into and really look at, okay, is there that trend? Is that the case?
I had an editor earlier this year tell me explicitly, do not have the word dissertation anywhere in your monograph. Even if it's to thank faculty members who were on your dissertation committee, do not use the word dissertation, because that might prevent a research library from buying your book. And obviously, you know, the academic publishing model for quite a while, especially the hardback monographs, are priced for research libraries.
Sure.
That's really how the academic presses remain economically viable. And if you have a situation where people start rejecting or not buying books, then you put the economic viability of the press in jeopardy. And that's what I think we're sort of at that moment where it's a grave concern. And how do you deal with this challenge, you know, given that things are changing, but they're not changing fast enough.
Yeah. I want to piggyback on that, but did you have something you were going to?
Me?
Yeah. Did you
Yeah, well, I was just thinking about on a positive note, the thing about open access is if your research is really current. I don't know, this happens in my field for sure, but the journals get backed up. So there's so many submissions and they've got to get them in the print journal. And so then there's backup. So you might have written something that's really relevant right now, but you're not going to actually get it out in print for another year, maybe longer. And so then at that point when it comes out, is it still relevant? And so that's also like a caveat here is where do you figure out that, depending on what your research is, how pressing is it to get it out right now versus a year from now?
Well, and to me, that right there has always been the incentive or kind of the promise of open access for me personally, is the kind of just the periodicity of them, the regularity with which they appear. Seems to me a really vibrant model for scholarship. I mean, I would much prefer something like that to the 2 to 3 year delay of when you get an acceptance and they say it's going to be 1.5 years, 2 years before it gets into print. And that's really the norm pretty much in literary studies. And it's frustrating. It's incredibly frustrating, right? I mean, it's hard to kind of keep published work current, because by the time it publishes, it's 2 to 3 years kind of old. You're ready to disown what you've said sometimes. So, I mean, the notion of scholars actually responding, I mean, I know there are scholars who keep blogs for this reason, and you'll have kind of communities within fields. So like in literary studies, for example, the DH community, there are scholars in digital humanities who will post blogs on a regular basis and sometimes get a community through that. They tend to prefer Twitter, but there are bloggers as well. And in some ways, that is a kind of ideal model of scholarship. Unfortunately, the institutions, I mean, there's just too many conflicts between individual scholars working within institutions. You have the academic presses, like we said. There's a lot of kind of factors at play here that prevent that model from just kind of shattering these institutions and creating a vibrant academic community. Because it is really attractive. It would be great to be, you know, publishing something, write something for a couple months, publish it, get response in real time, and kind of move from there.
I mean, it almost does feel like at the risk of oversimplifying, it almost feels like on some level, though, that scholarly communication hasn't quite grasped the capability of the internet in that sense. It's almost like that the model we use is kind of based on how it was done for years and years and years in terms of the print model. So it is the whole, you write your article, you submit it, and all this kind of happens behind the scenes, and there's all the work that goes into developing this print product. That could happen a lot faster, theoretically, in an electronic world. And it almost seems like in some aspects, there's almost a fear to sort of embrace some of what technology can let you do there, if that makes any sense.
well, I think Sam's comment spoke to that. I mean, there's I mean, you sort of questioned, are we prejudiced in favor of a print model versus an internet-based or web-based form of publishing? And I mean, I think I would say even in literary studies, that's the case. I mean, I think there's sort of a move to embrace more of that, but then at the same time, you also encounter resistance, right? And then ultimately, as the younger junior faculty who might be more interested, particularly in a field like DH, in getting your stuff out there, pursuing what are considered to be non-traditional models of publishing, maybe that includes open access for a web-based component of a monograph that doesn't quite fit the monograph model in print. We have these conversations at UC Santa Barbara, which is big in DH, and the question is always, okay, you can do this, you have more freedom, but then ultimately will it count the same as a print publication, either at the monograph level or at the journal level? And as junior faculty, we're sort of conditioned under the tenure model to always keep that foremost in our minds. So I feel like it operates at multiple levels, maybe a resistance to change.
Yeah. I mean, it almost seems like the sense that I get in having some of these discussions, I get the sense at a certain level, it seems like some of the junior faculty are more open to some of these newer models, but also understand that in the meantime, we've got to play the game, we've got to work with the system we've got, and that some of the tipping points towards some of these changes may become once those faculty get through that process on the other side, and kind of use some of that experience they've had and say, maybe we should look at doing this a little differently.
I think I think you're right. I think you're right to an extent, absolutely. Just one other quick thing to add is I think in the humanities and literary studies in particular, but I would imagine history and philosophy to an extent as well, is that the paradigm of the single author and the paradigm of the kind of the monograph or the article written by one author rather than a collaboration, I think is another thing that is going to be a big hoop to get through. In literary studies in particular, since it's a kind of interpretive or hermeneutic based activity where you're reading and interpreting things, there tends to be a lot less collaboration. It's less empirically based, some of the essays and articles that we write. So that's another hoop that I just think the sciences in some ways and fields that are based more in kind of empirical observation, they have a kind of natural transition into an open access model, perhaps a little bit easier than the single author fields. It's just one other thing to think about.
Well, did you want to talk a little bit about the work you're doing with coastlines?
Sure. So I guess we'll transition. So I'm actually the editor of.
Switching toward. We're
Yeah.
going to take this and use this as our segue into the education piece.
So I'm the editor of Coastlines, the literary journal of the USM Gulf Park campus, and I actually took over. Or would you do me a favor and hand me the mouse? I took over the editorial responsibilities at the end of the spring 2017 semester when Professor Will Watson, who was the previous editor, when he retired. And so one of my first, my first bit of business as the new editor was to solicit contributions from the student body and the surrounding community, which sometimes submits creative writing. And I found my initial responses to that call quite woeful. And so I actually first envisioned a web-based presence as just an easier way to recruit submissions, encourage submissions, and to manage the workflow, from the editorial perspective. But since I've gone and digitized a number of the back issues online, I've become aware of a happy consequence of the open access model here, and that's that some of the previous journals and in particular certain articles have found a worldwide audience. Previously, it would be released by the English department or the English program on the USM Gulf Coast campus. We'd have 50 to 100 journals printed, and most of them would either sit on a shelf or would go to authors who appear in that particular journal. There wasn't very much dissemination of any of this. But the last special issue that was published before Professor Watson retired was an environmentally themed journal which focused on environmental issues on college campuses. And so you have one of the articles published was the case against plastic bottles at USM Gulf Park, right? It was a kind of research-driven policy argument about why we should do away with plastic bottles. And I'm happy to report that USM Gulf Park has subsequently gone with the new water fountains, which are designed to cut down on plastic bottles, and that this has found actually, this article in particular, a worldwide audience. You can't see it quite well from where you are, but so far there have been 27 downloads of this article in the United States, 28 if you include Hawaii. It's also been downloaded in the United Kingdom and Europe and Australia and New Zealand. And many of these download locations are actually other universities. Okay, so I imagine that what's happening at this moment, or when these articles are accessed, is that students are essentially being put into contact with the work that the USM Gulf Park students have already done, and are using that to think about issues related to sustainability, campus transportation, plastic bottle usage. And so it's actually a happy discovery, and Craig and I were talking on Friday, and the fact that these are some of the most popular downloads suggests that there might be more of an audience for doing campus-specific or curriculum-focused journal issues, right? And then I think the students have very meaningful things to add to our dialogue as a society about some of these issues. This is, I want to hold this up as one of the gold standards for what can happen when you do have open access.
Just the ability, just quickly to add there too, I mean, the ability to kind of just track readership. Yeah, I mean, I guess to be fair, tracking downloads is not tracking readership. I mean, we need to be clear, right? I mean, but it gives us a start, right? I mean, it's more than I have with the articles that I have published in print journals, right? I mean, unless you're cited, it's very hard to track the readership of a print article. So, I mean, it would be great to have models like this on the scholarly side as well. I mean, that's one of the great things about open access, because it's online. It offers a lot of kind of back-end tools that allow you to do things with distribution, with analyzing kind of the distribution patterns, analyzing kind of readership patterns, etc.
And for those who aren't familiar with this, the journal actually is hosted now within Aquila. So that is one of the features that Aquila, the repository which I work with, can do, is we can actually publish scholarly journals through the platform itself. So, and speaking to your point, one of the things in our profession we're really kind of looking at a lot right now are various metrics, and how do you sort of analyze how much something's being used and how all those things work. And so one of the things actually that Aquila does now is that, for those who are familiar with it, we've integrated Plum Analytics, which tracks other sorts of metrics as well. So everything from citations to downloads to social media shares to news references, like references in news articles, blogs, that kind of thing. So things to try to give a little bit more of a complete picture of maybe how the research is being used beyond simply the download or the citation, that kind of thing. But so, again, like I said, there's a lot of work being done in that area that's still sort of being figured out, but there are some more robust things being done to try to look at exactly how everything's getting used. So, all right, so what we will do then is we'll use that kind of segue, because I want to be sure we have some time to get into this, talk a little bit about the education piece, how open access factors into education. So things like open textbooks or just open resources that can be used in the classroom, and maybe some ways that you're doing that now, or some ways you considered doing that, and just kind of maybe have that discussion and look at that side of the equation.
Kelly, you want to jump in on that?
Well, I have used it in my hybrid class. I don't that someone else is now teaching, but it's called Music Resources for Dance, and then that way it was really beneficial for me, because I was passed down a textbook that actually seemed to confuse my students more than it helped them. And when there was really only one chapter in that book that seemed to be relevant to them. And so trying to just totally reconceive of the class altogether and think about what resources would help them understand the material was really important to me. And so that's just a place that I started. And I'll also add that we have theater appreciation, and dance, but in the theater department, that all the theater appreciation classes now they have no textbook, they have all open access in Canvas. So and they did that specifically to skirt the cost for students and to help them engage in more current resources rather than just shifting back to the book that they'd always used. So I guess that's my starting place.
Sure.
Philosophy started thousands of years ago, and this need to be cutting edge, I don't feel the same urgency as I hear coming from some other disciplines. No, open access for me in terms of teaching means finding public domain versions of Plato's dialogue or something like that. And there are plenty of good resources. In fact, there's Project Gutenberg, these other sites that have vast collections now of philosophy, often respectable translations, all available for public domain. So I've started integrating more and more of those materials into my teaching.
Yeah, it's really kind of the interesting thing about open access with education is it kind of works both ways, right? On the one hand, it can help you stay really current, cutting edge if that's your need, because you can kind of roll things out as they happen. But if you're in a discipline that doesn't change that much, you don't have to worry about, okay, a new edition of this textbook's going to come out in 2 years that's going to cost a student a fortune, when the general readings you're using, the text you're using, really aren't changing. So.
Well, just quickly to add to that, like for the standpoint of English or a literature class, the version of the textbook tends to be an anthology. I mean, if I was teaching a course that had multiple novels and multiple different books, it would be hard to do an open access resource version of the course. But with an anthology like the American Literature Survey, early American Literature Survey course, which I teach, the anthologies are expensive. And unfortunately, they're just getting more and more expensive. And most of the stuff that I teach is out of copyright. So what I was able to do was find versions of these texts that were online. Some of them were online in proper formats, well edited, out of copyright. Others I had to edit myself, transcribe and edit, and just proofread more or less, because I could find a text version of a lot of these texts, but I would often have to edit things like the General History of Virginia by John Smith. It was a mess. I was able to find one through a resource at the University of Virginia, but I then had to edit it, and the first semester I taught it, it was a total mess, and then the second semester I edited it again the third time. And the students, in general, what I have found is I tried to create a Word document of the text, and I also create a PDF, and I give them options, and that's one of the things the students really like, is because they read on all sorts of different devices, which I have my issues about. We can talk about that perhaps. But they like having the Word document at times, they like having the PDF at times. They like having even an HTML file if it's possible, just because people are reading on different things. Sometimes it's computer screens, sometimes their phone. Yes, a lot of the students are reading on their phone. And they have found, this is the third semester I have done this. I'm not necessarily committed to doing it forever, but they have loved it. And whether or not I think it's a benefit to them, they love not paying for the anthologies. And they also like having access to the texts on their phones, tablets, and computers. They just say it allows them to kind of read at different times. So they have found it incredibly beneficial.
I think it also, when you look at mine, since I found resources that just help them put in context the content. So if I'm teaching, this is a music class for dancers, so they don't want to read music, they think it's a math problem and they don't want to do it. So if I can find ways to help them and be relevant, which has been a lot of my search in this. So if I found an article on math and dance that helped them understand how those things went together, then it helped them understand why music was important to dance. And it also just stays relevant to their way of learning, which I think is an important part of the open access. It's not trying to forget about the students are changing, and so then how am I changing in response to their learning strategies and modalities. Not meaning that I won't expose them to new ones, but also that there's a way that we meet in the middle.
No, that's a great point. Just to quickly add to that, like with a typical anthology, you'll get a 2-page introduction to the author, or maybe a page introduction to the author. And it's usually a pretty good introduction to the author, it's written by a scholar. But with few exceptions, something like Wikipedia can accomplish that, right? So what I do is I often will point my students to Wikipedia. If it's a long entry like Benjamin Franklin, I'll say, read the first 2 sections of the Wikipedia. And then what I do is I find like podcasts or YouTube videos, or I'll find kind of short 5-minute clips. There's a great NPR radio thing introducing Anne Bradstreet, for example, and talking about kind of death in the Puritan community, that I'll find other resources that will give them another portrait that kind of supplements the kind of standard critical introduction, which is more or less a Wikipedia article. Perhaps not perhaps in the anthology it might be slightly more scholarly written. But I found the ability to bring in multimedia sources really helpful as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say the multimedia, this is a whole other piece that's sort of opened up that, you can certainly have in some level with some of the commercial options, but there are lots of things out there that are available for free. Like podcasts, for example, or things of that nature. Yeah, absolutely. So, but that introduces whole other ways to cover things that aren't just a student sitting there with a textbook in their hand reading that material, or not reading this thing that they do. And there's also the piece of access, right? So like one of the challenges that we hear a lot of times is that students don't tend to get access to that book until, say, financial aid kicks in. So you're a couple weeks into the semester before they get that refund and can then go and buy their book. Whereas an open resource, you have the access piece also that is available from day one. It's free, so it's ready on the first day of class and ready to go. So that's another piece of that. And I did want to tease a little bit more of what you're talking about the online and sort of the online versus print, which doesn't necessarily mean, because you could theoretically print off an open textbook also, and maybe some of the effects of that. I'll give you an example. One of the faculty members who's done an open textbook with us mentioned that the first time that he used it in his class, he found that students didn't take the book quite as seriously because it was sort of an online resource. It wasn't like a physical textbook they had to go out and buy. And so that first time out, when the test rolled around, they all did significantly worse. Then he was able to sort of drive home the point that actually this is the actual text. You are going to need it. It is the relevant material for the course. Grades went back up and things were fine at that point. But there is almost like this mentality sometimes that maybe the students don't see it quite the same way too, if that makes sense.
That's certainly something I've had to struggle with. A lot of the material we talk about and I ask students to read, even in an intro section of philosophy, is difficult material. It's abstract. It really requires concentration and thought. And there's something about the online medium, and there's good empirical evidence to back this up, that just tends to encourage a more casual, acquaintance level, skimming almost, interaction with the text than what I want. The other problem I've had in a very practical sense is a lot of times, there may be one little paragraph in this dialogue I'll want to just spend 20 minutes talking about. And students won't have them with them. This paragraph from the old days where I would expect people to bring their text to class. Okay, open up your book to page, which seems maybe kind of fuddy-duddy nowadays, but there is a benefit if what you're doing is some kind of fine textual analysis. One student pulls up the phone maybe after 5 minutes or tries to open up a laptop. I don't know, that kind of mechanics is a little, I guess it's something I have to think through and plan for a little bit.
Yeah, one of the things we have an open textbook program we do here on campus. We do it in conjunction with the provost's office. And one of the things that we encourage for the people that apply for our program is to develop that resource, to have a print-friendly component if possible, so that the students who just prefer print can just print out certain sections if they're going to need it or whatever the case may be. But just to have that as an option, because I'm the same way you are, that sometimes it's just easier to concentrate on something if you have it physically in your hand, even if it is just printed pages as opposed to like a bound book. But so that way you can kind of address the differing models that way, different delivery models, so to speak.
I think the traditional way of marking up the text, right?
No.
As literary scholars, I absolutely appreciate that. And
Annotations along the margin.
yeah, and it's a challenge when you teach with either HTML-based or PDF-based text, because I'll often, in an effort to reduce the cost for my students, I'll make certain PDFs available to them, and inevitably they read it on their phone, which means they're not marking it up. And I mean, there are software programs that allow you to annotate PDFs, but then those might cost money as well, right? So. Yeah, and then how do you make it speak to all of those? So I guess we all have our preferred ways of reading and taking notes, and it's really just, I guess, it's on us as instructors to drive home to our students that they really need to be taking notes however they can in effort to submit their readings.
One technique that I have done, because this is the third semester that I've done this. In the first semester, I felt that they were coming to class, and I still feel it sometimes. They come to class and they've done the reading, but when I begin to ask questions, the faces, they're just blank stares. It's like the reading is going in and out, and they're not registering the reading, right? Because I mean, there is, as Sam said, there's empirical studies about reading online. Your mind, in some ways, unconsciously tells yourself that this information is externalized elsewhere, so you don't need to kind of incorporate it into your own mind. And there's something kind of heavy about print that allows the act of reading and writing gives substance to memory. So what I have done the last 2 semesters, that from a distance, I don't think it's been great, but the students continually come to me and say it's like the hardest thing they've ever done. I just had a student in my office last week saying like, this has been like, I've never had to do this. I have them basically keep commonplace entries. So I'm going back to the 19th century tradition of like 18th and 19th century tradition of keeping a commonplace book. Now, while I don't have them make it into a commonplace book, I do commonplace entries. So the first semester I had them do 20 of them, which is roughly 1 for every reading. This semester I cut it down to about 10 to 15. But what they have to do is, I have basically like 5 sections, and I say you need to make observations, like you need to write down like 5 to 7 observations, specific observations about the text. I have them write down like 2 key passages. I have them analyze a passage. So there's a commentary section where they have to analyze a passage. They have to write down 2 to 3 critical questions. And then the final section is connections, that they have to make connections based upon the reading. And throughout the semester, they hate it. They just complain. They say it takes a long time. But in my evaluations and at the end of the semester, when I really have a good discussion with them, they admit it's one of the most effective ways of forcing them to read and to kind of think about what they've read.
Right.
So I have found that helpful. But the weird thing about it is that it's pairing an online digital form of reading with a tradition that is incredibly based in print, right? The notion of commonplace books was all about people like reading in magazines and then writing down themselves thoughts. So it's interesting that has kind of had some beneficial effects.
Yeah, I mean, and you have to meet them where they are. I think sometimes as we're teaching, it's easy to be like, no, I just want you to do it this way, which is the way I did it, which I know is effective. But there's partly like meeting them where they are, which sounds like what you're doing, and then saying, but this is the effective way for you to learn it. Because if we never show them the way to translate what they're reading on their phones into a critical reading, then they're not going to discover that themselves. They're not going to be like, oh, this is totally effective, and I've got this figured out. Right? You have to like give them the steps to go through, and then maybe from there it might expose to the students that they do want to get a book and sit down and mark it out. Maybe that's what becomes beneficial to them. So exposing the process to them. We can't just go with the times. We have to also share what we know is effective.
It's amazing that but I think you're absolutely right, and it's somewhat depressing, but it's the reality. I mean, it's the reality that a lot of our students, and I think nationwide, a lot of students, they need to be trained how to make observations. They need to be trained that basically like, look, the first step of good reading is actually not underlining, right? But like translating that underline into an observation, right? And in some ways, all I'm doing is giving them a scaffold for doing that. And it's from my perspective, it seems pretty elementary, right? But they find it incredibly difficult because I'm asking them to process what they've read, which What a novel idea.
I do want to take a minute here to pause and see if anybody in the audience has any questions or anything you'd like to add to the conversation, because I know we've kind of been it's been a lot of us talking and not much of you talking, so I want to be sure to give that opportunity to you. All right, so apparently we're doing a good job of covering everything, so I don't see any questions, so we'll take that as a good sign, I guess. I do want to talk a little bit about, because you guys have touched on it a little bit earlier, but some of the digital humanities side of this too, and maybe integrating some of that into maybe both the research side of that and also the education piece in terms of integrating some of those materials into the curriculum. So.
Well, I think digital humanities, especially as it concerns literary studies and literary analysis, that's been one of the subfields of literary studies where there's been a kind of push to have more of the research available in an open access format. So I think there's a kind of push from this field in particular to make more things publicly available. And I think that my sense is somewhat that's tied to the technologies of analysis, which as they're developing and are made more freely available through coding and other such avenues, that those things work together, right? And so some of the tools for literary analysis that scholars can use for their research, if those tools themselves are available, the students can also use them, right? And so it can be incorporated in that way into the curriculum.
Can you say something a little more? I'm sorry to be the Luddite in the conversation, but a little more about the kind of tools you have in mind?
Yeah, so, and Craig, I'll just throw a couple out there, but as you have more ideas, please feel free to chime in as well. But so like Mallet is a program that is used for topic modeling, and basically you can bring a large corpus of text together and essentially allow computers to do some of the analysis, right? So topic modeling, in a very basic conceptual sense, scans a bunch of different texts and sort of color codes which words or ideas tend to appear in frequent succession, right, or in association with one another. And so, so I know some scholars at my former institution, CSB, who are sort of that they're analyzing how the humanities are talked about in public discourse, and that they're constantly pulling in articles published in different media news sources, and it's a kind of ongoing project to see how people are talking about the humanities. And so that's one. There are various tools for corpus linguistic analysis, right? But that's one of them. So that's kind of the one that I had in mind. But
Yeah, I mean,
others.
I've had students do kind of textual analysis with digital tools. I mean, the digital humanities is this big, huge kind of very elusive umbrella term that means different things depending upon the kind of situation or context you're talking about. I mean, one way to think of the digital humanities that I use in the classroom is just, it's the humanities, it's the kind of work that like libraries and museums did in the past, but now libraries and museums often are showcasing or curating their archival collections online. So, pointing my students to something like the Walt Whitman database, which includes all of his manuscripts, and giving them guided questions or guided prompts or like tour guides or like a scavenger hunt to do, giving them activities where they can then go into these digital archives and find out something new has been really beneficial. What's interesting though on that front is in some ways these targeted activities work better. What I've done this semester to compensate for the larger classes is I'm actually having students present. Each week, 2 students are presenting on a digital archive that is relevant to who we're reading or thinking about that week. So it might be like an archive that's relevant to Emily Dickinson. It might be an archive like the Pocahontas archive that has images of Pocahontas from 19th century art history. That when we were reading John Smith's General History, I would have them present it. And what's interesting is that the students despite my clear guidelines and despite my emphasis that they need to do more than just take us through each page on the website, they have a very difficult time standing back and thinking about this kind of digital object critically. They have a tough time kind of thinking about what do these manuscripts or this website that it allows us to see the kind of manuscripts or notebooks, how does it help us think about the text? They don't have the ability to ask those kind of questions. So it's just another challenge when you add kind of another resource, a multimedia resource or a digital resource. It asks new sets of questions, but it's hard to get the students to ask those questions right now, and we're struggling with that, but I just got to keep going and working at it.
You assign them the archive that you want them to look at? So like you point them to the Emily Dickinson archive that you want them to consider, or do you allow them to?
No, I point them to the archive. So I've done the kind of research. I know it's a solid scholarly archive, and I will either give them, in the past, I've given them kind of specific questions or a specific assignment, like compare the 1855 and 1866, editions of Leaves of Grass, or what have you, or compare two editions of Leaves of Grass, like an activity like that. Or in this case, I'm having them do the presentations. And the presentations have been good. They're taking ownership of it. But I don't think it's been quite as effective as giving them the kind of targeted assignments. That's my observation thus far.
Did you have something to
Just listening.
Yeah.
I guess what we'll do, because we're almost at the end of our time, is just maybe to kind of wrap things up, just kind of a general question to think about is where do you maybe see some of these things heading in, let's say, the next few years? Where do you see sort of the trends or the I guess the direction that some of these things you've looked at maybe heading? Do you see like open access becoming more common in publishing or in the classroom or things of that nature?
Well, I definitely see an expansion of the digital archives of the kind that Craig just mentioned. Manuscripts. The Folger Library, which is one of the major Renaissance libraries in the United States, the Folger Shakespeare Library in DC, has received a ton of grant money from the NEH, and the NEH is funding a number of projects that are digitally based with the intention of putting more and more archival materials online and more openly accessible to the public. So there was a program called Early Modern Manuscripts Online, EMMO, and their goal is to basically transcribe all of the manuscripts in the Folger collection, right? Recipes, things that haven't seen the light of day, to get those up, and it's a kind of open or crowdsourced transcription that they've relied on to do some of this stuff. So I definitely see that will, there's a move to make more of the library materials that have otherwise been archived more openly accessible. And I think that enables teaching in new and innovative ways. I think it enables scholarship in new and innovative ways. So I definitely see that as a trend to watch and to see to grow.
In my field, there's been a move to make philosophy more scientific, which in practice has meant that philosophers are encouraged to be involved in collaborative projects, both educational and research projects with members from other disciplines, often scientific disciplines. So cognitive science, as it's called, is a booming area of philosophy right now, which is sort of at the intersection between what we used to call philosophy of mind and what's going on in some brain science and genetics and places like that. And so to the extent that philosophers are willingly or not pulled into these other conversations, it by necessity is encouraging us to kind of rethink some of our traditional tools, both as researchers and educators.
I have two thoughts. One is that we just have to, as educators, will have to be more cognizant that our students don't know how to value one source over another source because everything is readily available. And so as we continue to have these open access and more things available to help, not only to show them how to figure out if a source is valuable or not, or credible, or real news or fake news, that's one thought. In terms of my discipline, I don't see much change in the journal world, but I do see that when I'm faced with, I haven't mentioned yet, is that is video and dance and how careful we have to be. I actually, for years, wouldn't let any of my pieces be on YouTube because that's my work. That's like my blood, sweat, tears, heart, emotion, and I want people to see my work in live form, not on the video. And so, but then there has to be a way to archive my work. So I've given over to it some. But then what happens is now, every dance is now all over the world. And so then it's the same thing. Like, how do I help value what I'm teaching versus what's available to them, and also ensuring that now somebody could watch a video of my dance and put it on some other people and maybe even just say it's theirs. I mean, there's a whole, that has never happened before. So that's, I think, where a lot of us are struggling with, what's the way to archive your work so that you can share it when you need to, but then, I don't know, not let people take it. Hard place to be in.
Yeah. I mean, just two quick thoughts. I mean, one, I think I see the classroom continually opening up. I think teachers and professors will continually listen to students and kind of appeal to students, but also kind of just, in a healthy way, challenge the rising cost of textbooks in ways that makes things more accessible. In terms of scholarship and publication, I personally, in literary studies, and I would probably argue in the humanities as well, I don't see it changing anytime soon. I think there's too much at stake with institutions, but also just the notion of what study is in the humanities as a kind of insular, kind of very self-reliant, studious activity that I think scholars are too self-absorbed, sometimes narcissistic, to just like suddenly give up the single author paradigm. And I don't say that kind of as necessarily a critique or a praise of scholars. I just say it as kind of a fact, right? That there's a history to the study as a physical location, and people withdrawing from society and kind of contemplation and thinking about something and then sharing their thoughts in the form of publication, that it's going to take more than a couple of years to go away. That's my suspicion.
Well, we have reached the end of our time, so please thank all of our panelists for a really, really great discussion. Again, be sure to grab an evaluation form and fill that out before you leave. Also help yourself to a pen, a brochure. Our last session, like I mentioned, will be in 2 days. It'll be over in Asbury Hall. That'll be our session on open access and help to nursing. So if you want to join us for that, we'd love to have you for that. And otherwise, have a great rest of the afternoon.